Welcome to Military Analytics. Tensions have been rising in Crimea recently. Internationally, Crimea is officially Ukrainian territory, and Ukrainian forces are diverting their attacks to Crimea to reclaim its legal right. The historical peninsula is frequently shaken by drone and missile attacks. Crimea has hosted numerous attacks in recent weeks, including multiple drone attacks on the region's largest city, Sevastopol. As the Kiev leader has often emphasized, the key Crimean and Ukrainian forces that will end the war are attacking with all their might for this. The offensive operations in many parts of Crimea are making the Kremlin administration and the Russian army very uneasy. The focus of these attacks is to liberate Crimea again. To this end, Kiev is accelerating its offensive operations in Crimea. The attacks by Kiev greatly frighten the Kremlin administration and the Russian army. Fear of the Ukrainian armed forces is causing Russian soldiers to flee Crimea. The evacuation of Russian headquarters in Crimea and the evacuation of Russian military families were announced last month by the Russian-backed military authorities of Crimea. It was a sharp move unleashed by great anxiety and fear. It was also an indication that the Russians could not cope with the Ukrainian attacks. In addition, the evacuation of Russian headquarters outside of Crimea in the past weeks was a vivid symbol of the uneasiness of the Russians. Ukraine's attacks on Crimea, Sevastopol, Simferopol, and near the Kerch Bridge were quite intense. The soldiers and commanders of the Russian army stationed in Crimea could not withstand this pressure any longer. Urgent support and evacuation requests were going to the Kremlin. In this week's update, British intelligence revealed a very dire situation for the Russian military in Crimea. According to British intelligence, the Russian-backed leader of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, is also concerned about the Russian army's ability to defend the peninsula. British intelligence pointed out that the main element of the Russian garrison, the 22nd Corps, has now mostly fled outside the peninsula and has suffered heavy losses. The majority of the fleeing soldiers belong to the 22nd Russian Corps. The 22nd Russian Corps is a unit of the coastal defense units of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy, established in 2017 after the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. The Corps is headquartered in Simferopol and controls units based in Crimea. However, the 22nd Corps, which is the main element of the Russian garrison, is now mostly stationed outside the peninsula and has suffered heavy losses. The Corps has a total of 40,000 soldiers. The casualties of these soldiers are estimated to be over 5,000, and the exact figures remain unclear. But it is estimated that the vast majority of the soldiers suffered from the Kiev attacks. After the evacuation of Russian military bases in Crimea, it is estimated that only around 10,000 Russian soldiers from the 22nd Corps remained on the peninsula. In other words, it is seen that around 30,000 Russian soldiers fled. Also, the 22nd Russian Corps is a paramilitary group. As is known in the last 20 years, Russia has experienced the proliferation of paramilitary groups in its regular armed forces. However, this paramilitarization has accelerated dramatically since Russia's attempt to invade Ukraine. Paramilitarization has reached particularly significant proportions in the Crimean Peninsula, according to UK Defense Intelligence. Sergei Aksyonov, the leader of the Russian occupation administration in temporarily occupied Crimea, was instrumental in establishing several local units that often claim to be affiliated with the Kazakh tradition. Most units were given semi-official status as reserve units of the regular army. According to UK Defense Intelligence, the Russian-backed leader of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, is keen to polish his patriotic identity by recruiting fighters, but is also likely worried about the regular army's ability to defend the peninsula. The UK Defense Ministry reported that Aksyonov will turn to recruit more paramilitary groups outside Russia's official military ranks to support the defense of Crimea against attacks. In fact, Aksyonov is not unjustified in his concerns because Crimea is regularly attacked, and the Russian army cannot prevent these attacks. The measures taken by Russia in Crimea do not seem to have relieved the authorities or the people of Crimea. The peninsula, shaken by the attacks, is being evacuated. A Ukrainian official said that thousands of Russians fled Crimea and abandoned their properties, fearing that an expected counterattack by Ukraine might target the Black Sea Peninsula. About 500,000 to 800,000 Russians currently live in Crimea legally. Russians may be forcibly deported in accordance with Ukrainian legislation and international legal norms. Fearing this possibility, Russian citizens sell their properties and leave Crimea. The Russian evacuation of Crimea is also seen in the real estate market. It's not possible to say the exact number by looking at the real estate market, but there are many who leave. On the other hand, it turned out that the Russian administrations in Crimea were preparing evacuation plans for their employees. Russian authorities on the peninsula are making a list of workers and their families who are subject to priority evacuation. In fact, it is among the information that escape plans have already been created and approved in some cities. It was announced that such a plan was being prepared in the northern part of the peninsula, close to the Ukrainian mainland in the town of Krasnoperekopsk. It seems that Crimea is now becoming a region where both civilians and soldiers long to escape. So how are the attacks that caused the Russian soldiers and civilians to flee on the peninsula? And what methods does Ukraine use to target Crimea? Crimea has hosted many massive attacks in recent weeks. Last night, Ukrainian drones illuminated the skies of Crimea. The drone swarm launched simultaneous offensive operations in many areas of Crimea. Last week, Crimea was also the scene of what regional officials described as an act of sabotage. It was reported that the explosions caused train to derail, which led to the suspension of rail traffic between Sevastopol and Simferopol, the capital of Crimea. 8 grain wagons derailed as a result of the explosions. 50 meters of the track was damaged, and a 1.5-meter-long crater was formed under the tracks. An explosion on the railroad tracks in Crimea disrupted deliveries of supplies and weapons to the Kremlin's Black Sea Fleet, including Kalibr cruise missiles, according to a report by the UK Ministry of Defense. Citing intelligence data on Twitter, the disruption of delivery dealt serious blows to Russian logistics. Crimea is critical to Moscow's control over the occupied territories in southern and eastern Ukraine and plays a role in the supply of Russian troops. Military experts say the attacks on the infrastructure served to disrupt Russian military plans and make it difficult for Moscow to prepare for the anticipated Ukrainian counterattack. Russia is trying to strengthen its defense in Crimea as it cannot resist offensive operations. Crimea used to be known for its seaside resorts. The coastline, stretching for 25 kilometers, is now filled with defensive structures occupied by Russian troops instead of sun loungers and umbrellas. It has dragon's teeth made up of pyramid-shaped concrete blocks designed to block the way for tanks and other military vehicles along the coast. Behind the dragon's teeth are a series of shields that protect against incoming attacks. Several bunkers can also be seen along the trenches. Ukraine also has a big trump card against the measures taken by Russia. This trump card is the powerful Western tanks that Kiev has. These dragon's teeth can be crushed and eliminated by Western tanks. Also, some military experts argue that the defenses are a precaution as Ukraine has very little naval capability. Ukraine's options to attack the peninsula have increased after the U.S. administration said that it could target Crimea with American weapons. Attacks on Crimea target critical logistics lines for Russia. As a result of these attacks, Russian supply is disrupted. This situation also demoralizes the Russians and deprives them of the resources they need. Crimean attacks do not have a military dimension. Only these attacks also cause social collapse and psychological fatigue. It's only a matter of time before social collapse brings with it uprisings and rebellions. The war between Ukraine and Russia has triggered security issues in Europe, the Black Sea, the Baltics, the Nordic and the Mediterranean. The fact that the geography between the North Sea and the Mediterranean is under the pressure of a great Russian aggression pushes NATO and the USA to take very drastic measures. Of course, Poland is one of the countries that was most affected by the war between Ukraine and Russia and took the heaviest measures against Russia. Poland has recently been home to high-tech American weapons systems and thousands of American soldiers as NATO's eastern stronghold. Poland, together with the U.S. Army, Euro-Africa's Sixth Corps, and NATO's Northeast multinational corps allies and partners, will conduct the Griffin Shock exercise of unprecedented size in European history at the Bemopolski training ground in northeast Poland. Griffin Shock is an exercise designed to demonstrate how the United States as a framework nation can rapidly strengthen the NATO combat group in Poland and properly expand battalions in Poland to large brigade-sized elements. The implementation of this exercise will support NATO's deterrence initiatives and the new NATO First model that the Allies agreed upon during the 2022 NATO summit in Madrid. US Army General Darrell Williams, commander of the U.S. Army, Europe and Africa and NATO's Allied Ground Command, the subject of exercise. Griffin Shock is speed, scale, flexibility, and preparing to defend NATO territory. The integration of NATO and national military planning to rapidly transform the NATO combat group in Poland into a full combat brigade under the command and control of a NATO divisional headquarters is another example of the alliance's new era of collective defense. So how many people will the exercise be conducted with? This is exactly what makes Griffin Shock so important. More than 100,000 soldiers from the United States and NATO countries will participate in the exercise to advance their interoperability goals. This is the highest participation ever in joint NATO exercises in Europe. Griffin Shock will validate our ability to rapidly transform the NATO combat group in Poland into a full combat brigade under the command and control of the Northeast NATO Multinational Division. The sharing of joint capabilities with the Polish Armed Forces General Command and the Northeast Multinational Corps is a crucial development for the Western Alliance. So which units will participate in the exercise? US. Participating units include the 4th Infantry Division, 4th Infantry Division, Artillery, 4th Infantry Division, Maintenance Brigade, 2nd Cavalry Regiment, 21st Operations, Resume Command, 16th Maintenance Brigade, 12th Combat Aviation Brigade, and 14th Field Artillery Battalion. In addition to Poland and the United Kingdom, Romania, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia will also participate in the exercise. The Griffin Shock exercise includes all military abilities. It provides the opportunity to provide effective, realistic, and lively training. This exercise will be conducted to test and validate current and future capabilities and improve tactics, techniques, and procedures through such exercises. Allies will demonstrate that they are a highly capable, flexible, and interoperable entity capable of deterring potential aggressors and confronting and defending them when necessary. The Ukraine war has proven what an important ally Poland is, both to Ukraine and NATO. Poland shares its eastern borders with Kaliningrad, which is connected to Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia due to its geographical location. NATO has greatly increased security, especially on the Polish border, as a possible escalation of the Ukrainian war would hit Poland first. Poland has increased its importance not only on the border, but also on the beans and ammunition sent to the Ukrainian army. Weapons from developed countries such as the United States and United Kingdom go to the Ukrainian army via Poland. Considering this dimension of the Ukraine war, Poland again played an important role. Shortly after the announcement of the Griffin Shock exercise, a military logistics and equipment center was opened in Powice, which will receive thousands of units of military equipment. The Polish Ministry of Defense emphasized that this project is the largest infrastructure project financed by NATO and the USA in the last 30 years. The LTD SMC Center was built on the model of U.S. bases, tanks, infantry, fighting vehicles, artillery, technical security vehicles, and self-propelled guns. Will be stored in the center's warehouses. The U.S. Embassy in Warsaw reported that a total of about 5,000 weapons will be deployed to the headquarters. So what sets LTT apart from other bases? Storing military equipment at this base will significantly shorten the response time of U.S. forces, which will strengthen the security of Poland and the entire eastern flank of NATO. The security system established by NATO is entirely based on this principle. The center is an important element in deterring potential rivals and a manifestation of solidarity within the North Atlantic Alliance. The center will allow to quickly receive reinforcements from allies. This will reduce the arrival time from 1.5 months to a few days if the necessary weapons and ammunition are transported from the USA. Ultism occupies 60,000 meters squared of warehouse space with adjustable humidity levels. Equipment and materials necessary for repair and operation can be stored here. Implementation of the project took 6 years. In addition, this project cost NATO and the USA $360 million. It also went down in history as the largest one-time investment in the alliance's infrastructure in the last 30 years. In recent years, Washington and Warsaw have invested heavily in a network of facilities used by U.S. forces in Poland. Poland has become the center of U.S. military efforts to contain Russian aggression on NATO's eastern flank. With the opening of this base, both NATO's eastern borders will become more secure, and the weapons and ammunition required for the expected counterattack of the Ukrainian army will be sent faster than expected. The Kremlin has not yet made a statement about the Griffin shock exercise and LTTSC. However, the allegations from Kremlin officials who did not want to be named are that these developments made Russian President Putin very angry and at the same time uneasy in light of these developments. NATO will take a step back into the past at an important summit to be held in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. Leaders are poised to scrutinize and approve thousands of pages of secret military plans detailing how the alliance would respond to a Russian attack for the first time since the Cold War. So what exactly will the actions that will be discussed at this summit aim at? This action plan marks a fundamental change for NATO. For decades, NATO saw no need to draw up large-scale defense plans as it fought smaller wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and felt that post-Soviet Russia no longer posed an existential threat. But with Europe's bloodiest war going on in Ukraine since 1945, the alliance must now base all its plans on the possibility of a potential confrontation with a powerful rival like Moscow. Many Western experts warn that NATO should make these plans long before the start of the war. The key difference between crisis management and collective defense is that it is our competitors, not us, who set the timeline. We must prepare for the fact that conflict can manifest itself at any time, he said. NATO will also guide nations on how to develop their forces and logistics, outlining its plan of action, which it calls regional plans. So is this preparation for a new Cold War, as in the Cold War? NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg said on highly classified documents that would deploy certain troops for the defense of certain regions. Allies will know exactly what forces and capabilities are needed, including where and what situation, and how to deploy them. This formalizes a process triggered by Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea that prompted Western allies to send combat troops east for the first time, with the United Kingdom, Canada and Germany, each taking the lead in one of the Baltic states. But while many features resemble NATO's pre-1990 military cadre, priorities seem to have changed for NATO, which has since expanded nearly 1,000 kilometers to the east and has grown from around a dozen to 31 members. Ukraine's eastern front lines have turned into a hellhole for the Russians. Clashes on the eastern front lines such as Marinka, Andriivka, Opitin and Divika increased. In addition, military movements on the Lyman and Siversky front lines have drawn a lot of attention in recent days. So as you can see, the Luhansk region was not as active as Donetsk. On the other hand, in cities near Bakhmut, such as Kremovo and Ivanovsky, Russian attacks decreased considerably. The Ukrainian armed forces launched a major offensive operation in Bakhmut. However, this operation intensified in the southern line of the city with the decrease of Russian attacks in Bakhmut. The special forces of the Ukrainian army took the opportunity of the Russians to take a passive position in the city of Bakhmut and settled in the southern flank of the city. The Ukrainian Azov Regiment and the 4th Assault Brigades continued to attack Shvika from both directions. Tankers serving in the Azov Regiment broadcast a video showing how they attacked the Russian fortifications in the north of the village. The Ukrainian offensive lasted only 16 minutes in total. In addition, the attack in this city was carried out with at least 2 tanks belonging to the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian armored combat vehicles advanced towards Russian targets in Klashchevka under the protection of tank fire. Ukrainian infantry units, which will come into close contact, also took advantage of this cover fire and tried to infiltrate the Russian trenches in the city. As a result of the barrage of Ukrainian infantry units, the Russian forces hid in bunkers in the wooded areas of Shvika. Since there are no shooting ranges that provide 360-degree protection in the shelters where the Russian troops are hiding, the Russian soldiers in this area decided not to leave the shelters they were in until help came from their comrades. But the Ukrainians launched an incredible attack with grenades at the bunkers where the Russians were located. The Ukrainians succeeded in clearing off few more tree belts after their continued offensive north of Shvika. According to the most recent reports, the Russians controlled the main trench on the hill and the 2 groves around it. Russian troops had to withdraw from places outside this region, but that was only half the bad news for the Russians. A few days ago, A Wagner-affiliated source reported that the Ukrainians had crossed the river channel at Krasivka and continued to develop the second offensive line. According to some intelligence reports, Ukrainian forces crossed this river bridge when the Russians left the front lines in Zivivka and expanded the offensive area in the city. Information about when the Ukrainian forces captured the underground canals and how many minutes they passed the river connection bridge in Shvika was shared by the Ukrainian army in these attacks. Ukrainian fighters from the 80th Assault Brigade also destroyed Russian ammunition depots with unmanned aerial vehicles. In addition, Ukrainian artillery or mortar crews crushed Russian positions 500 meters south of Krasivka. Despite the difficult conditions, the Ukrainians crossed the channel and approached the Russians, taking them by surprise. They successfully controlled positions on the other side of the canal in Zivivka. This was a very important situation for the Ukrainian forces because this meant that the Ukrainians would further their plan to swallow Krasivka from both sides. The Ukrainian forces almost slit the bridge in Zivivka and managed to besiege the Russian soldiers from both directions by seizing the underground channels and bunkers. A prominent Russian military analyst said the Russian forces lacked the organization, fire support, coordination, and training necessary to defend Bakhmut flanks. The analyst also complained that Russian forces allowed the Ukrainian army to drive an infantry fighting vehicle to the Russian front lines in Vika for 15 minutes. This was a very important detail for the execution of a successful offensive operation. As mentioned earlier in Zivivka, there was a wide network of ditches on a hill surrounded by two small forests that formed an extremely strong fortification. Ukrainians dominate these areas for now. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drone operators from the 5th Assault Brigade focused on the opposite side of this area, namely the Russian positions in the forest. The footage showed how they destroyed a Russian mortar position and an ammunition depot. Ukrainian warriors, apparently on the verge of the main Russian fortifications, were waiting until other troops attacked Plizivka from the north and south. In this way, there is a high probability that the Russians will leave their positions for fear of being trapped. Ukrainian forces are unlikely to relinquish their advantage in this region. That's why the attacks continue at full speed, because undermining Russian defensive capabilities here is extremely important. To this end, the Ukrainian infantry continued to make tactical gains while the Ukrainian artillery and drone crews were turning Russian logistics into a nightmare. The Ukrainian 28th Mechanized Brigade has released a video of how they hunted Russian reinforcements near Avdiivka with the help of Ukrainian UAV operators and artillery crews. The road in this area was constantly monitored for 24 hours. Then Ukrainian fighters managed to destroy 10 Russian vehicles, including one tank of the Russian army. The vehicles were carrying ammunition and manpower to the Russian forces on the Ukrainian front lines. In addition, Ukrainian military officials had previously reported that Russian forces transferred unidentified airborne and motorized rifle units from the direction of Luhansk to the direction of Bakhmut. And many of these soldiers were mobilized. The Russian armed forces began to be seriously concerned about the progress made by the Ukrainian army because the efforts of the Russian forces to reinforce the military from the Luhansk direction was one of the most concrete examples of this situation. The most important reason for Putin's army's logistics efforts was that Russia's missiles were running out. Russia spent its military resources in an unplanned manner as it launched 10 mass missiles to destroy positions in Ukraine. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, used this situation quite well. In fact, the Ukrainian army has been using this striking war strategy since the first day of clashes. This war strategy of the Ukrainian army primarily includes a resounding offensive action. Then the Ukrainians do not move for a certain period of time after this offensive action. In the meantime, retaliatory attack operations often fail because the Russian forces, who cannot bear this situation, act without a plan no matter what the conditions are. That is why the Russian army has a great shortage of military resources. Of course, the Ukrainian army also suffers ammunition losses in this process. However, the Ukrainian army makes up for these deficiencies in its inventory with US-made Patriots, 16 fighter jets, and MiG warplanes sent by Poland with too many ammunition and bullets to count. So what surprises will await us on the battlefield now? The advances of the Ukrainians on the eastern front lines will eventually be reflected in the southern parts of the country. Thank you for watching us.